It was the early morning of June 12, 1944, and the rising sun spilled pale gold over the pine-dotted hills surrounding Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The air, still cool with the remnants of dawn, carried the faint tang of dew, damp earth, and the smoky curl of burning wood from distant mess fires. A thin mist hovered over the wide parade grounds, softening the harsh lines of barbed-wire fences and the regimented rows of wooden barracks. Yet the crispness of the morning made every detail almost painfully vivid: the glint of sunlight on metal helmets hung in storage, the worn edges of boots lining the barracks steps, the flutter of canvas tents trembling in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the camp, a rooster crowed, a mundane sound that somehow seemed incongruous with the gravity of the lives contained within these fences. Inside the camp, a long line of trucks rumbled along the gravel road, each carrying German prisoners of war captured in the deserts of North Africa. Their uniforms were caked with dust, their faces hollow from days of irregular rations, their eyes wary and uncertain, scanning the world around them as if every shadow might conceal danger. Some clutched their jackets tighter around emaciated shoulders, others leaned warily against the metal walls of the truck, gripping cold handles and exchanging furtive, tense glances. The distant clang of the mess hall bell echoed across the compound, a strange, almost alien signal for these men who had become accustomed to scarcity. There was a hum of apprehension in the air, a collective curiosity laced with disbelief, as though each man were bracing himself for what he feared might be a cruel trick, yet secretly hoping it would not be. Even before the trucks came to a stop, a scent drifted through the air, rich and warm, the buttery. The mess hall stretched across the compound like a quiet cathedral of routine and abundance, its pale wooden walls glowing softly in the early morning sunlight that streamed through tall, narrow windows streaked with dust and the faintest fingerprints. The light seemed almost holy, touching every surface with a golden sheen, illuminating the long rows of tables that had been polished to a soft, almost reflective gleam, their edges rounded from years of use and the constant presence of human hands. The high ceiling, crisscrossed with dark beams, echoed with the faint, rhythmic clatter of cutlery, the occasional thud of a tray being set down, and the soft shuffle of boots against the worn wooden floor. It was a building that carried both purpose and comfort, a space designed to contain men and feed them, but also to impress upon them the rhythm and order of life in captivity here. Not harsh, not punitive, but precise, measured, and, in an almost startling way, generous. From the moment the German prisoners stepped closer, the smell hit them, rich, warm, layered, almost overwhelming in its depth and familiarity, yet wholly alien. The tang of sizzling butter curling upward from trays of scrambled eggs mingled with the sharp, smoky sweetness of frying sausages, the soft caramel scent of pancakes steaming under glistening pats of butter, and the heady, almost cloying aroma of golden syrup and freshly baked bread. It was a fragrance that promised fullness, that spoke of kitchens stocked to the brim, of resources so abundant they could be piled without limit on plates and trays. Even the air itself seemed to shimmer with the richness of the morning. The faint smell of polished wood mingled with the sharp tang of cleaning solutions, the subtle mustiness of old floorboards, and the slight metallic edge of the sunlight hitting cutlery in preparation. Every sense was engaged, every nerve tingling with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The prisoners lingered at the threshold, feet planted hesitantly on the polished floorboards, eyes scanning the expanse before them as though trying to memorize every detail in case it disappeared before their touch. Their uniforms, faded and caked with dust from long journeys, hung loosely on their thin, weathered frames. Some men pressed fingers to the edges of their jackets, as if ensuring they were still real, still part of themselves, while others let their hands drop to their sides, the tremor of anticipation making even the simplest motion feel exaggerated. One man, his face sharp with exhaustion and his cheeks hollow from the past week's meager rations, shifted weight from one foot to the other, eyes flicking from tray to tray, from table to table, each laden with quantities that seemed impossible. The sheer abundance was a shock. Eggs piled high and steaming, sausages glistening with rendered fat, pancakes stacked with perfect symmetry, golden rolls that seemed impossibly light and soft, fresh fruit in neat bowls, and even pitchers of milk and coffee that sat waiting for them. It was as if the hall itself had been constructed not merely to serve food, but to assert the quiet, overwhelming generosity of the world beyond the fences and the deserts they had endured. The prisoners' gazes traced the lines of tables, noting the precision of arrangement, knives and forks laid exactly parallel, plates aligned to a strict rhythm, trays brimming yet never spilling over. Every table seemed to hum with life before a single bite had been taken. The collective anticipation of the men charged the air with a subtle, almost electric energy. The Americans moving among the tables, soldiers in neat uniforms, carried trays with steady hands, nodding briefly at prisoners as they passed, their movements calm but practiced. There was no rush, no tension. The soldiers moved like conductors orchestrating a symphony, ensuring each element fell into place at the precise moment. Even the sounds of the hall, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of a plate being placed, the distant hum of conversation, combined into a rhythm that was unfamiliar and almost hypnotic to the newcomers. A few prisoners pressed their noses slightly closer to the trays, inhaling deeply, as though by breathing in the aromas they might also inhale a fragment of the abundance itself. One young man, barely 20, his hair dark and matted from weeks of travel and exposure, closed his eyes for a moment, letting the scent fill him, imagining himself at home before the war, at a table with his mother's cooking, the sunlight pouring through a window, the faint sound of birds in the garden. Another, older and stooped with the weight of fatigue, reached out a hand almost reflexively, as though touching the tray might confirm its reality. The textures, the colors, the steam curling upward in perfect plumes, all of it was overwhelming, a sensory tapestry that demanded recognition. The steam from the trays fogged the nearby windows, creating halos of diffused light around the edges of the room. And for a brief moment the men could have been anywhere, could have been free, could have imagined a world untouched by war, scarcity, or hunger. Even the mundane details struck them with quiet fascination. The way the sunlight caught the edge of a knife, making it glint sharply, as though it had been polished specifically to impress. The way the syrup pooled and caught in the folds of a pancake, sticky and golden, reflecting the light in small, radiant mirrors. The way the butter softened imperceptibly as it lay atop steaming eggs, tiny rivulets forming along its edges before being absorbed into the food below. These were small miracles to men who had known only rations measured in grams, whose senses had grown dull from weeks of deprivation. Each visual, olfactory, and auditory detail compounded the sense of unreality, as though they had stepped into a painting, a staged scene designed to awe and humble them simultaneously. A faint murmur ran through the line as they began to process the scene. Low, tentative German phrases. The windows themselves seemed to participate in the spectacle, each pane etched with the faint scars of age, capturing the early light and scattering it in soft patterns across the wooden floor. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of sunlight, catching in the glimmer of a fork or the sheen of a buttered pancake. The long tables, stretching far into the hall, each carrying their perfectly arranged bounty, seemed to stretch into infinity, suggesting a limitless abundance that made the prisoners' stomachs twist with longing and disbelief. Some men crouched slightly, craning their necks to see the ends of the tables, as though verifying that the banquet stretched as far as it seemed. Every sensory detail, the shine of trays, the color of eggs, the crisp smell of bread, the soft warmth radiating from steaming food, served to reinforce the impression that this place, this hall, this morning, existed outside the boundaries of ordinary experience. Even before the first bite, the prisoners were aware of subtle cues in the Americans themselves. A cook paused to wipe his hands on a towel, his movements slow and deliberate, exuding a confidence born of familiarity with this routine, as though feeding hundreds of men was both an art and a duty. An orderly carried a tray across the room, balancing it expertly, nodding politely at a group of German prisoners who watched with wide eyes. The scene was both orderly and intimate, the mechanics of provision elevated by the human touch, the awareness of those serving that they were not merely giving food, but also conveying care, a small but potent act of acknowledgement and normalcy. The prisoners' internal responses were almost as complex as the hall itself. Some felt a surge of cautious hope, fragile but undeniable, while others were paralyzed by disbelief, unable to reconcile the opulence before them with the stark scarcity they had endured. A man traced the rim of a plate with a finger, marveling at its weight, its cleanliness, its almost ceremonious presentation. Another inhaled deeply, closing his eyes, letting the combination of scents, the rich eggs, the smoky sausages, the syrupy pancakes, the earthy bread, wash over him in a wave that was almost intoxicating. In that moment, the simple act of breathing became a meditation on survival, abundance, and the strangeness of kindness in a world defined by conflict. Even the structural elements of the hall contributed to the awe. Beams overhead cast patterned shadows that shifted as the sun climbed, elongating and contracting with the passage of time. The windows themselves reflected movement, catching a soldier's arm here, a tray there, scattering light across polished surfaces. Dust motes twirled slowly, suspended in the shafts of sunlight, a reminder that every detail, no matter how small, mattered. The floorboards, the chairs, the perfectly aligned trays, even the faint squeak of boots, all contributed to a sensory experience that was overwhelming in its richness and subtle in its orchestration. The prisoners' first steps into the hall were hesitant, almost reverential. As if crossing a sacred threshold, they were both forbidden and desperate to enter. Each man moved with the weight of months of exhaustion pressing down on thin shoulders, their boots scuffing softly against the polished wooden floor. The sound both familiar and strangely alien in this environment of order and abundance. Hands hovered uncertainly above trays, retreating and advancing like dancers in a cautious, improvised choreography. Their eyes roamed continuously, taking in every detail with a mix of disbelief and craving, the glossy sheen of syrup cascading over soft, stacked pancakes, the plump, golden rolls glistening with butter, the steam curling from fried eggs in delicate, aromatic tendrils. A subtle tremor passed through many of them, not from cold or fear, but from the shock of sensory overload, the realization that what they were seeing, smelling, and soon to taste was unlike anything they had encountered in months, perhaps in their entire adult lives. One man, tall and gaunt, with cheeks hollow from deprivation, reached out slowly toward a plate of eggs, his fingers quivering slightly, as if afraid that the simple act of touching the food would shatter the illusion. He traced the edge of the plate lightly, almost reverently, and then withdrew, his eyes darting to the American soldier beside him. The man's expression was guarded, cautious. A faint tension lingered in the lines of his jaw, betraying an internal debate he did not voice. Was it allowed? Would someone stop him? Could this abundance possibly be real? The silence of the hall, punctuated only by soft footsteps, distant murmurs, and the occasional clatter of cutlery, answered him with a quiet affirmation, yet disbelief clung stubbornly like a shadow. A younger prisoner, barely more than a boy, leaned forward, his back curved from weariness, eyes fixed on a mound of pancakes that seemed impossibly high, glistening with butter that melted and pooled at the edges. He inhaled deeply, the scent filling his senses with a dizzying richness, evoking memories of home, distant, almost dreamlike recollections of breakfasts with his family, the smell of fresh bread, sweet preserves, and tea on the windowsill of a warm kitchen. His lips parted in a faint gasp, a sound half hidden behind a cough, and he hesitated before finally reaching for the pancakes, his fingers brushing the warm surface. The act was tentative, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though even this small engagement with sustenance was a sacred, almost forbidden ritual. Other prisoners moved with a different rhythm, reflecting the subtle variations of fear, hope, and conditioned expectation. Some shuffled forward slowly, eyes flicking to the trays and then to each other, whispering brief German phrases filled with disbelief and wonder. Ist das wirklich? Is this really? One murmured, voice quivering slightly as it broke the silence. Another man, older, stooped from exhaustion, allowed himself to let his hand hover over a tray of sausages, his palm trembling as though the very act of claiming the food required courage. The aroma of frying meat was intoxicating, sharp, smoky, and deeply satisfying, pulling at the memory of meals long missed and forgotten. With each step, each breath, each glance, the prisoners' bodies absorbed the environment around them, learning through movement the extraordinary truth of the momentary, that abundance could exist, that generosity could be tangible, and that hunger could be soothed not by rationed fragments, but by plentiful, deliberate provision. A small group clustered near a table of eggs, their hands moving almost in unison, as if governed by instinct and necessity rather than conscious thought. Fingers hovered, dipped, withdrew, and returned, the rhythm punctuated by soft exclamations, whispered astonishments, and occasional laughter that seemed almost disbelieving. One man picked up a knife, turning it over in his hand, marveling at its weight and balance, the cold metal warming slightly as it made contact with his skin. Another lifted a roll, squeezing it lightly to test its softness, the yielding texture confirming the impossibility of such a treat after months of stale bread and rationed crumbs. Each action was deliberate, cautious, as if the simple act of touching, lifting, or tasting were fraught with significance. The steam rising from the trays seemed to trail behind them like a halo, mingling with the warm light streaming from the windows, creating a surreal, almost ethereal atmosphere that blurred the line between reality and imagination. Some men closed their eyes briefly as they inhaled, allowing the sense to engulf them, tracing memories, desires, and cravings back through months of deprivation. Each inhalation brought a shock of pleasure, a mixture of hunger and awe that forced a shiver down the spine, a tightening of the chest, a fluttering in the stomach. The richness of the air, the warmth, the soft murmur of movement, and the faint hum of conversation became a symphony of sensation, drawing out responses both physical and emotional, visceral and profound. Interactions among the prisoners were quiet but telling. A tall man nudged a younger one with a shoulder, a subtle gesture of encouragement, as if silently granting permission to partake. The younger man responded with a hesitant nod, eyes wide and unblinking, absorbing both the food and the social reassurance that he was not alone in navigating this strange, abundant world. Another prisoner, older and cautious, shifted his gaze to the American soldier distributing eggs, noting the calm efficiency of his movements, the polite nods, the faint smile as he placed plates on trays. It was a form of guidance unspoken, yet immediately understood the prisoners could take, could eat, could claim their share without fear. The realization, subtle but profound, began to ease the tension coiled within their bodies, allowing fingers to reach, hands to lift and mouths to finally anticipate the taste to come. Each bite, when it finally occurred, was a revelation. The eggs, rich and creamy, seemed almost impossibly soft, their warmth spreading from tongue to stomach in waves of satisfaction. The sausages, smoky and flavorful, carried a heft and richness that made previous meals. Thin soups, hard bread, ration scraps, seemed ghostly and distant. Pancakes, golden and steaming, absorbed syrup in a slow, deliberate way that accentuated their sweetness, each bite a layered experience of taste, texture, and memory. Men closed their eyes, savored silently, or let small exclamations escape their lips, a soft symphony of wonder and delight. The act of eating, so simple yet previously fraught with struggle, became a full engagement of body and mind, an intimate dialogue between hunger, fulfillment, and astonishment. Even the smallest gestures revealed the depth of impact. Fingers brushed against a plate with careful attention. A hand lingered over a roll before lifting it to taste. An eye followed a stream of syrup as it pooled across a pancake, small smiles breaking across drawn faces. Some men laughed softly at one another's astonishment, sharing the delight and disbelief, while others remained silent, savoring the experience inwardly, letting each moment unfold with deliberate patience. Every movement, every decision, every small act was amplified by the contrast to months of deprivation, the stark realization that abundance could be offered without threat, without scarcity, without fear. Time itself seemed to dilate in the hall. Each moment stretched as prisoners absorbed the scene around them, moving deliberately, almost ritualistically, from tray to tray, plate to plate, bite to bite. The air grew warm with the combined presence of bodies, the steam curling from trays thickening and twisting in the sunlight. Small gestures, a nod, a glance, a whispered comment, became acts of shared humanity, reinforcing a sense of connection that transcended the physical environment. Even in captivity, even amidst the shadows of war, these men found themselves responding not only to food, but to the subtler signals of care, order, and attention surrounding them. Some prisoners paused mid-step to look at each other, exchanging unspoken observations. By the time the prisoners had settled themselves at the long wooden tables, the initial shock of abundance had begun to evolve into a complex symphony of reactions. Quiet laughter, incredulous murmurs, deep sighs of relief, and the occasional sharp intake of breath as a particularly rich or savory taste revealed itself. The tall, gaunt man who had hesitated at the edge of the hall earlier now sat with shoulders slightly relaxed, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, letting the warmth seep into his fingers and, through them, into his tense, exhausted body. He took a tentative sip, the bitterness tempered by cream and sugar, and closed his eyes, allowing the flavors to wash over him like a small, miraculous wave. He remembered the desert heat, the thin rations of bread and beans, the constant gnawing emptiness in his stomach, and the stark, unrelenting monotony of hunger that had dominated the past months. And now, here, warmth and richness were not rationed, not carefully measured in grams, not withheld behind scarcity. They were plentiful, deliberate, and offered without hesitation. Around him, the younger prisoners had begun to shed their initial caution. They reached across tables to pass dishes of eggs, sausages and pancakes to one another, sometimes exchanging shy smiles, sometimes laughing softly at each other's astonishment. The movement was slow and tentative at first, but it gradually gained confidence, a rhythm born of necessity, but deepened by the quiet joy of shared abundance. Fingers brushed against hot plates, steam curling upward to kiss foreheads and waft into the air around them, carrying scents that seemed almost intoxicating in their richness. One man lifted a fork to his lips, paused mid-air, and then gently lowered it again, overcome not by hunger alone, but by the sheer disbelief that food could exist in such quantities, so lavishly, so unapologetically. Around him, the collective gasp of the prisoners echoed softly, a chorus of amazement that threaded through the hall and mingled with the clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation. Some men had begun to talk, quietly at first, in a mixture of German and broken English, trading descriptions of the tastes and textures, comparing bites, and attempting to articulate their astonishment. "Die so weich und doch perfect," murmured one, gesturing with a fork as though to physically communicate the extraordinary quality of the scrambled eggs. The sausages, their real meat, not powdered or salted beyond recognition. Another replied, voice low but tremulous, as though even speaking the truth aloud might undo it. Across the hall, a younger prisoner chuckled, eyes wide as he dabbed at a drip of syrup that had slid down the side of a pancake, the action almost ceremonial in its care. In that small, deliberate movement, in the attention paid to something so simple, the magnitude of the moment became apparent. This was more than sustenance. It was an affirmation of humanity, a reminder that even in a world consumed by war, care and generosity could manifest in tangible, transformative ways. The Americans serving them moved quietly among the tables, their presence both efficient and understated, offering a subtle choreography that reinforced the prisoners' growing sense of security. Plates were replenished without question, coffee mugs quietly refilled, and the occasional word of encouragement or polite nod offered at precisely the right moment. The prisoners began to recognize patterns, small cues that communicated safety and trust, a gentle smile from a server, a casual glance that said, "Take your share," the predictable rhythm of trays being set down and collected. Slowly, imperceptibly, the prisoners' tension began to ease. The first hesitant bites had given way to deliberate tasting, the nervous, trembling hands had steadied, and the quiet awe was transforming into something more comfortable, more enduring, a shared, human connection, fragile but undeniable. Conversation grew more animated, though still subdued, punctuated by the occasional laugh or exclamation of delight. Men leaned toward each other across the tables, comparing bites of pancakes or swapping tastes of sausage, sometimes holding a piece up for the other to try before cutting their own portion. The act of sharing, so simple yet so profoundly human, became an unspoken bridge between the prisoners, erasing for a moment the hierarchical, militarized world outside these walls. Even small gestures carried weight. A hand resting briefly on a companion's arm, a nod of mutual understanding, the silent acknowledgement of astonishment shared across a glance. It was a tableau of quiet, intimate humanity unfolding amidst the grandeur of abundance, a scene that carried more emotional resonance than any battlefield engagement could. The act of eating itself became a meditation. Each bite, carefully lifted to the mouth, absorbed not only by the senses but by memory and imagination, carried echoes of past deprivation and present relief. The softness of the eggs, the smoky richness of the sausages, the syrup sliding slowly over pancakes, each sensation reinforced the improbability of their reality, magnifying the sense of gratitude, wonder, and quiet joy. Some men closed their eyes, savoring the warmth and richness as though tasting the world itself, allowing the experience to flow through their bodies, releasing months of tension, hunger, and apprehension. The act of eating became a sacred ritual, a deliberate celebration of life, resilience, and the strange, unexpected generosity of strangers. Even subtle gestures became charged with meaning. One man, noticing a neighbor's fork shaking from anticipation, offered a gentle nudge of encouragement, a silent invitation to partake freely. Another paused to watch a boy tear off a piece of roll, astonished at the softness and warmth, and smiled faintly, almost involuntarily, remembering his own childhood meals, simpler and yet suffused with comfort and familial love. The hall itself seemed to respond to these gestures, the air thick with warmth, scent, and the faint, golden sunlight streaming through the dust-speckled windows, illuminating. The final act of the scene was subtle but deeply resonant. The prisoners, having eaten their fill, leaned back in chairs, some with closed eyes, others tracing the lines of the hall with slow, reflective glances. The clatter of cutlery softened, the hum of conversation became gentler, and a pervasive sense of quiet satisfaction settled over the room. The abundance, once overwhelming, now felt almost ordinary, but ordinary in a way that made it extraordinary, a natural, unforced generosity that was both tangible and unforgettable. In small gestures, a shared piece of bread, a whispered comment of delight, a nod to a neighbor, a soft exhalation of contentment, the prisoners absorbed not only the sustenance but the message it carried, that even amidst conflict and captivity, kindness, abundance, and humanity could exist. As the sunlight shifted across the windows, casting long shadows over polished tables and steaming trays, a reflective stillness pervaded the hall. Faces once taut with disbelief and tension now softened, eyes brightened with the quiet glow of satisfaction, and the hum of human life continued, steady and unbroken. For the German prisoners, the experience would linger far beyond the last bite, leaving an indelible impression of warmth, generosity, and shared humanity that contrasted starkly with the world they had known. In that simple, extraordinary act, sharing a meal, offering abundance freely,